For generations, Nepal was described as a country trapped between two enormous civilizations. To the north, Tibet; to the south, India. And from that geography came one simple assumption: Nepalese must be a mixture of the two. But modern DNA has exposed a much more remarkable story. Ancient genomes recovered from the Himalayas have shown that populations genetically related to modern Tibetans were already living in the mountains of what is now Nepal more than 3,000 years ago. One of the earliest individuals in the new ancient DNA record lived around 1494 to 1317 BCE, centuries before the rise of classical Indian kingdoms and long before modern China or Nepal existed as political ideas. These ancient Himalayan people were not simply modern Tibetans who happened to move south recently. They belonged to a lineage that had already formed on and around the Tibetan Plateau, carrying ancestry connected to late Neolithic populations of the northeastern plateau, as well as a much older Paleolithic component that appears distinctive to Tibetan genetic history. Then came something even more surprising. Modern Sherpa, Newar, Tamang, Rai, Magar, and Indo-Aryan-speaking Nepalese do not all descend from the same population in equal proportions. Their genomes form a geographical pattern stretching from the high Himalayan mountains down to the southern plains. The Sherpa are remarkably close to Tibetan populations. Middle hill groups show mixtures of Tibetan-related and South Asian ancestry. Indo-Aryan-speaking populations in the Terai connect strongly to the same deep ancestry found across northern India. So the real genetic origin of Nepal is not one mysterious tribe, one forgotten civilization, or one foreign migration. It is a meeting point created by several ancient population histories. And the most extraordinary part is that the DNA now gives us the ability to see some of those movements directly, including ancient people who lived in Nepal thousands of years ago. The first thing we have to forget is the idea that Nepalese ancestry can be explained by drawing a straight line from India to Tibet. Geography certainly matters, but geography does not tell us when populations moved or how they mixed. Modern populations are the final product of thousands of years of demographic change. Nepal contains more than 100 ethnic groups and many different linguistic traditions, and genetic researchers have repeatedly found that these groups do not share one uniform ancestry. A major genomic study of Nepalese, Tibeto-Burman, and Indo-Aryan populations found significant differences between the country's ethnic groups, with some populations strongly connected to Tibetan ancestry, while others show much stronger South Asian ancestry. The researchers describe the Himalayan region as a genetic cline, meaning that ancestry changes gradually across geography rather than suddenly at one border. High-altitude populations, such as Sherpa and Tibetan groups, occupy one end of that line. Middle-altitude Tibeto-Burman populations, such as Tamang and Gurung, occupy intermediate positions. Indo-Aryan-speaking populations of the southern and lower regions connect more strongly with South Asian populations. That pattern is far more interesting than the old half-Indian, half-Tibetan description because it suggests that Nepal was not created by one mixed event. Instead, different population movements occurred through different routes, at different times, and at different elevations. The Himalayas acted not as an absolute wall, but as a directional barrier. Some people crossed from north to south. Others moved along the southern edge of the plateau. Trade and marriage connected the middle hills. And the result was a country whose genetic map broadly follows the landscape itself. The ancient DNA evidence changes the story even more dramatically. In 2022, researchers published genome-wide data from 38 ancient individuals recovered from 7 archaeological sites in the Mustang and Manang districts of Nepal. The dates ranged from roughly 1494 BCE to 650 CE, giving scientists a genetic record spanning more than 2,000 years. Several of these individuals lived during periods when we previously had almost no direct ancient genome evidence for the Himalayas. The oldest samples, from sites including Suila and Lubrak, date to the 2nd millennium BCE. Researchers found that these ancient high-altitude Himalayan individuals were genetically closest to present-day Tibetans and formed an early branch within the Tibetan-related lineage. Most of their ancestry could be modeled as coming from populations related to late Neolithic groups living near the northeastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau, but they also carried a smaller component of a much older Paleolithic Eurasian ancestry that appears to have contributed specifically to the Tibetan genetic tradition. This means the Tibetan genetic story itself is not simple. The ancestry that eventually became characteristic of Tibetans was built from multiple ancient layers before populations expanded across the high plateau and into the surrounding Himalayas. And once that lineage moved south, it left descendants among Himalayan populations in Nepal. This is one of the strongest pieces of evidence yet, that Nepal's northern genetic history is deeply connected to the ancient Tibetan Plateau, rather than being a recent consequence of modern migration. The age of these ancient Nepalese genomes is particularly important. The earliest individual in the 2022 study was dated to approximately 1494 to 1317 BCE. That is more than 3,000 years ago. By that time, humans were already living at high elevations in the southern fringe of the Tibetan Plateau and had developed a distinctive genetic profile. This pushes direct evidence for the Tibetan genetic lineage in the Himalayas back much earlier than many previous studies could demonstrate. The researchers also found that the ancient Himalayan populations formed a genetic cline that connects them with later Tibetan groups. This does not mean that every modern Nepali Highlander is directly descended from one of these archaeological individuals. Populations are rarely that simple. It means that the ancestral population represented by these ancient individuals was part of the genetic stream that later contributed to populations living across the Himalayas. The distinction is essential. Ancient DNA tells us about population connections, not a simple family tree in which one ancient skeleton equals millions of modern descendants. But even with that caution, the finding is extraordinary. Thousands of years ago, the genetic structure associated with high-altitude Tibetan populations was already present in Nepal. The Himalayan connection is therefore not a recent historical development. It reaches deep into the Bronze Age. The Sherpa provides the clearest modern example of this ancient Tibetan connection. Their name is now famous around the world because of their extraordinary history in Himalayan mountaineering, but their genetics tell us something deeper about their origins. A study examining 582 Sherpa individuals from Nepal and the Tibet Autonomous Region analyzed both mitochondrial and Y chromosome variation and found that Sherpa lineages were overwhelmingly connected to indigenous Tibetan populations. The researchers concluded that Sherpas appear to represent a relatively recent branch of the Tibetan population, rather than a population that had remained isolated in Nepal for tens of thousands of years. 2 Sherpa-specific mitochondrial sub-haplogroups were estimated to have separated from mainland Tibetan lineages relatively recently, with divergence estimates under 1,500 years in that particular analysis. Other genome-wide research using 111 Sherpas and 177 Tibetans produced a somewhat broader estimate of approximately 3,200 to 11,300 years for Sherpa-Tibetan divergence, illustrating an important scientific reality. Different datasets and mutation models can produce different dates. The overall conclusion, however, is stable. Sherpas are much more closely connected to Tibetan populations than to lowland South Asian populations, and their distinct identity developed relatively recently compared with the deeper history of the populations from which they descend. Their genetic story therefore points north across the mountains rather than south toward the Indian plains. The Sherpa story becomes even more fascinating when we examine altitude adaptation. Living at high elevation creates one of the harshest environments the human body can face. Atmospheric pressure drops, oxygen availability falls, and lowland populations can develop dangerous physiological responses. Tibetans and Sherpas have evolved a different strategy. Instead of simply producing enormous amounts of red blood cells, their bodies regulate oxygen delivery in ways that reduce the physiological costs of hypoxia. Genes involved in oxygen sensing and regulation, including EPAS1 and EGLN1, are central to this adaptation. These variants became famous because they appear at unusually high frequencies in Tibetan-related populations and show evidence of natural selection. The important point is that the adaptation does not have to be as young as the Sherpa migration into Nepal. Their ancestors could have developed much of this genetic adaptation while living on the Tibetan Plateau and then carried those variants southward. That means the Sherpa body contains a record of an environment their ancestors inhabited before the community became established in Nepal. Their ability to survive at extreme altitude is therefore another clue connecting them to the ancient Tibetan population history revealed by the archaeological genomes. Genetics and physiology are telling the same broad story. But Nepal is not simply Tibetan, and this is where the story becomes much more interesting. Move down from the highest mountains into the middle hills, and the genetic landscape changes. Populations such as Tamang, Gurung, Rai, and Magar retain substantial Tibetan-related ancestry, but also show evidence of additional ancestry from other East Asian and South Asian populations. The 2022 Ancient Genome Study proposed that Tibeto-Burman-speaking communities living around the southern and eastern margins of the Tibetan Plateau followed at least 2 broad routes into the Himalayas. One route moved along the plateau and into the high Himalayas, producing populations closely connected with modern Tibetans and Sherpas. Another route appears to have traveled around the southern and eastern edges of the plateau, involving low-altitude East Asian populations, and producing genetic patterns distinct from the high-altitude Tibetan lineage. This helps explain why 2 communities may speak closely related languages, but have different genetic histories. Language can move across populations. People can adopt a language without completely replacing the existing gene pool. Conversely, populations can migrate while maintaining only part of the ancestral language. The Himalayan genetic map therefore cannot be interpreted purely through language, ethnicity, or geography alone. All three have to be considered together. The Tamang are an excellent example of this middle zone. Their ancestry contains a strong Tibetan-related component, but they are not simply modern Tibetans living south of the mountains. Their population history reflects interaction with other southern Himalayan communities. Studies of Nepalese Tibeto-Burman speakers show that many of these groups received East Asian ancestry through roots that were distinct from the one that produced the Tibetan Sherpa lineage. Some populations also show measurable South Asian ancestry. This produces a gradient rather than a single boundary. The further south you move, the more South Asian ancestry generally appears. The further north and higher you move, the stronger the Tibetan-related signal becomes. The middle hills sit between those poles. They are exactly where migration, trade, language contact, and intermarriage could create new population structures. This is why the Kathmandu Valley became so important. It occupied a geographic position where travelers from the Tibetan Plateau and the Indian Plains could meet, trade, settle, and marry. The genetics of the Newar reflect that history. They do not sit at one extreme. They sit in the middle, carrying a distinctive combination of ancestry that cannot be explained by either Tibet or India alone. The Newar are especially interesting because Kathmandu is not merely a geographical location. For centuries, it has been one of the most important cultural and commercial centers in the Himalayan region. Newar merchants historically participated in trade routes connecting Nepal with Tibet and northern India. The community developed a distinctive language, religious traditions, architecture, art, and urban culture. Genetics confirms that this cultural crossroads was also a biological crossroads. The Newar carry both Himalayan and South Asian ancestry, and the exact proportions vary depending on the dataset and population model. This is important because popular discussions often ask whether the Newar are Tibetan or Indian. The genome says the question is wrong. They are a historical population formed from multiple ancestral streams. Their identity emerged from a specific place where those streams met. That makes the Newar one of the clearest examples of how a population can become culturally distinct while being genetically mixed. Their ancestry is not evidence of confusion. It is evidence of connectivity. The Kathmandu Valley did not simply sit between two worlds. It connected them. Then we descend into the Terai, and the genetic story changes again. Indo-Aryan-speaking populations in Nepal show much stronger affinity with the deep South Asian ancestry profile found across northern India. Genome-wide studies of Nepalese populations identify a strong ancestral North Indian component among Indo-Aryan-speaking groups. This ancestry is not the result of one recent migration from modern India. ANI itself represents a complex ancient ancestry formed through multiple population events within South Asia, including ancestry related to ancient South Asian hunter-gatherers, Iranian-related populations, and steppe-related populations that entered the subcontinent during the Bronze Age and afterward. The same broad architecture can be found in northern Indian and Pakistani populations. This is why the southern Nepalese genetic landscape crosses the modern border so naturally. The Terai is part of the wider Gangetic and South Asian demographic system. People living on one side of today's international boundary can share ancestry with communities on the other side because the ancestral population existed long before the border was created. The DNA therefore exposes how recent modern political geography really is. The contrast between the Sherpa and Indo-Aryan populations is therefore dramatic. At the northern end, Sherpas carry overwhelmingly Tibetan-related ancestry and show very limited influence from the South Asian populations surrounding them. In the eastern Nepal genome study, Sherpas could not be modeled as having significant Indian ancestry. At the southern end, Indo-Aryan populations show exactly the opposite pattern, with strong South Asian ancestry and much less of the highland Tibetan component. Between them are groups such as Newar and Tamang that carry different mixtures of both. This is not a random distribution. It follows the landscape. The Himalayas created a directional genetic barrier, but people still moved across and around them. Over thousands of years, this produced what researchers describe as clines. A cline is not a line dividing two races. It is a gradient showing how ancestry changes gradually from one region to another. Nepal is one of the clearest places in Asia where geography and genetics can be seen operating together. Ancient DNA makes that gradient even more impressive because we can now compare people who died thousands of years ago with people living today. The ancient individuals from Mustang and Manang show ancestry closely related to the Tibetan lineage. Present-day Sherpa and Nepalese Tibetans remain strongly connected to that lineage, but modern, non-Tibetan Tibeto-Burman populations show additional ancestry from other sources. This means the Himalayan genetic history was never frozen. It continued changing after the first people arrived. The Tibetan genetic lineage itself also changed as populations from the northeastern plateau contributed ancestry to communities that were already adapted to the highland environment. Researchers found evidence for two broad ancestral routes, one moving through the plateau and another around its southern and eastern edges. This is one reason the modern Tibeto-Burman speaking populations are genetically diverse despite sharing linguistic relationships. Their languages preserve one kind of history, their genomes preserve another. When the two are combined, the migration picture becomes much clearer. The phrase, the genetic origin of Nepal, therefore needs to be used carefully. There is no scientifically credible single population from which every Nepali descends. The evidence clearly shows multiple ancestral sources. What researchers have been able to identify is a particularly strong ancient connection between Himalayan populations and the Tibetan Plateau. This connection is not based only on modern DNA. Ancient individuals dating back more than 3,000 years already show it. That makes it far stronger than a theory based solely on present-day similarities. At the same time, South Asian ancestry in the southern and central regions is equally ancient and important. Nepal's genetic history is therefore best described as layered. One layer is associated with ancient South Asian populations. Another is connected to the Tibetan Plateau. Additional layers came through lowland East Asian migration and later regional gene flow. The proportions differ from one community to another. This is why the country contains such extraordinary genetic diversity within such a relatively small geographic area. There's one more population that gives us a glimpse into a completely different side of Nepal's genetic history, the Raut, one of the last nomadic hunter-gatherer populations in the Himalayas. A 2025 scientific report study examined their genetic and demographic history and found that the Raut have a distinctive genetic profile shaped by long-term isolation and their unusual mobile lifestyle. Their ancestry is primarily South Asian, but they possess genetic features that distinguish them from neighboring settled populations. The study is significant because it shows that Nepal's population history cannot be reduced to a simple north-south Tibetan versus Indian model. There are populations within Nepal with their own long-standing histories of mobility and isolation. The Rauta demonstrate how unique ecological and social systems can preserve genetic structure even when surrounding populations change dramatically. Their story adds another layer to Nepal's genetic landscape, reminding us that the country contains not just migrants from outside, but also communities with distinctive histories that developed inside the Himalayan region itself. Nature, calm, and this is where the story becomes even more beautiful. For thousands of years, people have looked at the Himalayas and seen separation. Mountains seem to divide cultures, languages, climates, and civilizations. But DNA shows movement everywhere. Ancient people were not trapped by the mountains. They used valleys and passes. They traveled along river systems. They traded through highland routes. They crossed into new ecological zones. Some settled permanently. Others kept moving. Every movement changed the genetic landscape. The mountains slowed gene flow, but did not stop it. That is why Nepal has populations whose ancestry can be traced toward different directions. Some point north to the Tibetan Plateau. Others point south into the Indian subcontinent. Some carry both histories. Nepal's genetic identity is therefore not an accident of geography. It is the product of geography interacting with human movement over thousands of years. One of the most important scientific corrections is that ancient civilizations and genetic populations are not the same thing. The Indus civilization was a cultural civilization. The Tibetan Plateau had several archaeological cultures. The Ganges Plains supported many different populations and societies. A modern population may inherit ancestry from people who participated in several different archaeological cultures. Therefore, asking which civilization created Nepal is not really the right genetic question. A better question is, which ancient populations contributed ancestry to the people living in Nepal today? When asked that way, the evidence is much clearer. Ancient Himalayan populations related to the Tibetan Plateau contributed substantially to the ancestry of northern and high-altitude groups. Ancient South Asian populations contributed substantially to populations in the south. Additional East Asian and regional Himalayan populations contributed to the middle zone Tibeto-Burman communities. The result is a network of ancestry rather than a single civilization. So if someone tells you that Nepalese people are simply half Indian and half Chinese, the DNA says that is far too simple. If someone tells you that all Nepalis came from Tibet, the DNA says that is also wrong. If someone tells you that modern Nepalese ethnic groups are genetically identical because they share one nationality, the evidence contradicts that too. The real story is more precise. Geography shaped migration. Language followed and sometimes reinforced those movements. Marriage systems maintained distinctions. Trade connected communities. Ancient Tibetan-related ancestry moved south into the Himalayas. South Asian ancestry moved north into Nepal. Middle hill populations absorbed ancestry from several directions. Some groups remained remarkably isolated. Others became genetic bridges. The biggest discovery, therefore, is not one ancient ancestor. It is the pattern. The high Himalayas preserve a strong Tibetan genetic legacy. The middle hills preserve mixtures. The Kathmandu Valley reflects centuries of connectivity. The southern plains preserve the deeper genetic architecture of South Asia. And ancient DNA shows that the northern layer has been present in the Himalayan region for more than 3,000 years. That is something no modern political map can erase. The border between Nepal and Tibet is modern. The border between Nepal and India is modern. The genetic connections are ancient. Thousands of years before modern governments existed, people were already moving through these landscapes. They carried their genes, they carried their languages, they carried their technologies, they carried their religious traditions, and eventually their descendants built the communities we recognize today. That is why the title, Scientists Reveal the Real Genetic Origin of Nepal, has a surprising answer. There is no single origin. There is a northern ancestry connected to the ancient Tibetan Plateau. There is a southern ancestry connected to the ancient population history of South Asia. There are middle hill populations carrying both, and there are isolated communities preserving their own unique demographic histories. The real Nepal was never a genetic buffer zone. It was a crossroads, and perhaps that is why the country became so culturally diverse despite occupying such a narrow stretch of land. Because people were always meeting there. The mountains did not stop history, they concentrated on it. The valleys did not isolate humanity, they connected it. And today the genome allows us to see those connections more clearly than ever before. If your family comes from Nepal, your DNA does not tell a single story. It tells a layered one. Maybe your ancestors lived on the Tibetan Plateau. Maybe they came through the middle hills. Maybe they belong to the ancient South Asian populations of the plains. Maybe your ancestry contains several of those layers at once. But whichever community you belong to, one fact is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Nepal's genetic history is much older than Nepal itself. It began before modern borders, before modern religions, before modern ethnic categories, before anyone had written down the names of the populations whose descendants would one day live there. The mountains have been standing there for millions of years. Humans have been crossing them for thousands, and their DNA is still here, not as one bloodline, not as one race, not as one ancient civilization, but as a living record of movement across one of the most extraordinary landscapes on Earth. That is the real genetic origin of Nepal. Not one beginning, many beginnings, one country, and thousands of years of ancestry meeting in the shadow of the Himalayas.